thanks to Frank DiStefano for the very generous introduction of my dad, and he is the final guest preacher during my sabbatical, and I couldn't have my dad preaching here and not be here. But as we were saying in the car on the way down, I said, what a blessing it has been for me to have a father who's been so loving, encouraging, and supportive of me for 59 years, and how fortunate I've been to have a father who's made it to 91 years old and is still sharp. And so I don't want to take any more of his time, because I said, remember, we got breakfast after the first service, Dad. So let me share with you the scripture that will set up his message on meeting life's challenges. It comes from 1 Samuel, and it's part of the beginning of the narrative of the story of David. But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. He said, "Neither is the Lord chosen this one." Then Jesse made Shammah pass by, and he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Samuel said to Jesse, "Are all your sons here?" And he said, "There remains yet the youngest." Back one slide. "There remains yet the youngest, but he is keeping the sheep." And Samuel said to Jesse, "Send and bring him, for we will not sit down until he comes here." He sent and brought him. This verse always cracks me up, because it just said the Lord, doesn't look on the outward appearance. But the writer of 1 Samuel wants you to know now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. The Lord said, "Rise and anoint him, for this is the one." Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. This is the word of the Lord, and please give my dad a warm BBC welcome.
It's great to be back here at this church, but it's so hard to follow Doug, right? Jill and Doug and I went over to the Brewster Whitecaps game on Friday night, and they were greeting everyone, and everyone was greeting them. And one of the men came up and said, Doug introduced me, and he said, "You're Doug's father? I want you to know he's the best preacher in the whole United States." And I agreed with him. After all, I am his father. And I want to thank Frank. Frank, I got to say, the guy you talked about at 91, I don't even remember him. But one last thing before we start, because I know we got to get to breakfast too. So Doug said, don't go too long with this. But it's such a joy to be here in Brewster. And I came from Seattle. When I told my friends in Seattle this week that I'm going to be preaching at BBC, they said, "What is BBC?" I said, "Well, it's really two things. It's Brewster Baptist Church or Best Baptist Church." And you are the Best Baptist Church. The national media has said that there are 4 influences that we're seeing among Americans in our society today, 4 trends that are taking place. That people are more lonely, they are less trusting, they are more divided, and they are less optimistic. Today, we are going to look at one of the major figures of the Bible, David, and through the lens of his life, we are going to look at these 4 significant challenges that we are facing as Americans today. And I'm going to do so by sharing with you, if you will, 4 snapshots from the life of David. The first is that we are more lonely. And that first snapshot is of David and Mephibosheth from 2 Samuel, the 9th chapter. Mephibosheth was the son of Jonathan. Jonathan was David's best friend, but he was also, Mephibosheth's grandfather was the former King Saul. And so because of that, his life was in danger, because whoever became king did away with any people who might have a claim on the throne. And so out of fear, he hid himself. He was, if you will, isolated, alone, lonely, cut off from everybody. But then there was a knock at the door, and it was David's forces, military, and said that he had been summoned by David to see him. And so he came to David in fear and trembling. And David says, "You don't have to fear a thing. I have brought you here to show you kindness." And Mephibosheth was absolutely startled when he said, "I'm going to give you back all the land of your grandfather." And Mephibosheth said, "Why would you treat your servant, who was no better than a dead dog, with such kindness?" And David said to him, "Because your father was my best friend, and I made a pledge to him, and from now on you will always have a place at my table, just like a son." And from then on, Mephibosheth was no longer cut off, isolated, lonely, and alone. Alone is one of the great themes of life and also of literature. Let me quickly mention three of them to you. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh flew the first solo, nonstop, single-engine flight from New York to Paris, a distance of 3,610 miles, and he did it in 33 and a half hours. Many books were written about the lone eagle, and one of them was entitled Lindbergh Alone. In 1934, one of the great American explorers, Commander Richard E. Byrd, went to the Antarctic for a period of 5 months to do exploration, and he went alone. And when he came back, he wrote a book simply titled Alone. In 1999, a young boy of 9 years of age, Javier Zamora, left El Salvador, and he traveled for 9 weeks and over 3,000 miles to come to the United States. In 2022, last year, he wrote a book entitled Solito, which in Spanish simply means cut off, isolated, lonely, alone. Imagine you're 9 years of age and you are alone and making that trip. And it was at that point that God entered into his life through the kindness of strangers. Patricia, a young mother of 28 years of age. Carla, her daughter, who was 12 years of age. And a man named Chino, a young man of 19. And they became his surrogate family. They would be together for the rest of this odyssey that was going to take place. It's pretty amazing to think what happened. For, first of all, they journeyed over turbulent seas from Guatemala to Mexico in an open boat for 18 hours nonstop, packed in like sardines. And then they would go over the desert at night, traveling through all of the various hazards, and all they had were basically the clothes on their back, a little meager bit of food, and that precious gift of water. And through it all, they kept going and going. They'd made this venture not only once, not twice, but 3 times. And in spite of all of the obstacles, which were so great, God's grace was even greater. And on that 3rd try, they were able to make it to Tucson, Arizona, to a safe house where his parents had to pay a ransom of $1,500 in cash to get their son. And the next day, they were reunited. Now, there's several things in this story that I think are very important. First, God works through the kindness of strangers. Sometimes you and I are the recipients of that kindness. Think of those times when you have been. And at other times, we are the givers of that kindness to help others. Second, we see in this story that God uses ordinary people like Patricia and Carla and Chino to help other people. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And third, God has written his promise in large letters in that first chapter of Joshua when he tells us, I am with you. Do not fear. Do not worry. Do not get discouraged, for I am with you wherever you go. And surely he was. Here's a footnote to this first story. Javier Zamora, in the front of his book, wrote, this is dedicated to Patricia, to Carla, and to Chino, without whom I would not be here. And he never met them again, though he tried. And second, the United States government gave him an Einstein visa because of his contribution to America. He went to Cal and to Stanford and to Harvard. He became an internationally renowned poet and writer. We never do know what God is going to do with our lives, do we? Second, we are less trusting. And the second snapshot we have is of David with a young couple named Uriah and Bathsheba. Uriah was a loyal lieutenant in David's army. He was a fierce fighting man, and he was off at the wars fighting for king and country when David betrayed his trust and took his wife. And shortly after that, Bathsheba came to him and said, I'm pregnant. And David tried to cover up, as you know, and the cover-up didn't work. And so he told his commander, you put Uriah in the heat of the battle, where the point of the battle where it's fiercest, and then withdraw so that he will be killed. And he was. What was true then is true today in so many ways. Go to England in 1887. 1887. And Lord Acton sent a letter to Bishop Creighton, and in it he said that the moral law should apply to each and every person, politicians and clergy alike, because it is so often that what happens in our lives is that we allow the power to overtake us, that power corrupts us, and ultimate power corrupts absolutely. And again, we see that in our own time. Very quickly, let's look at those two things that he mentions, both the politicians and the parish, if you will. Too many politicians in our time disseminate disinformation, alternative facts, all sorts of things like this that disrupt our society. They are looking more at their own self-serving interests rather than of the nation, and that's wrong. And the church, the parish, has even been worse. As I flew out here from Seattle, just before I came out, I heard, as many of you did, that in Chicago, the Attorney General had cited the fact that the Roman Catholic Church and Diocese of Chicago and Illinois, that there were some 450 priests who were pedophile priests who had abused over 2,000 children over a period of decades. And it was a repeat of the 2002 example that we had right here in Boston, which was exposed by the Boston Globe's Spotlight reporting. A terrible tragedy, and worse than the political dimension, if you will. Not only are people fleeing from the church because of this and other things like it, but the fact is that this is the Judas complex. In other words, the betrayal of trust. Let's move in another direction and move in a positive way. What can we do to bring about truth and trust in our society, in our divided society today? I think there are some things that we can do. If you turn to Joshua Friedman in the emotional intellectual program that he has, he mentions 4 C's that we can use to help bring about truth and trust. And I've taken those 4 C's and moved them from the secular and put them into the sacred and attach them, if you will, to the most important C, the 5th C, Christ. And they fit like hand in glove. Let's look at those 4 very quickly if we're going to bring about truth and trust. The first is commitment. Commitment. Matthew 5:37. In Matthew 5:37, we told in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. In other words, say what you mean and do what you say. And from Luke, the second word is caring. In Luke 6:31, we have the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And then consistency from 1 Corinthians 15:58. Stand fast. Stand fast. That's an important truth for us to be aware of. And finally, a 4th C that is, if I can remember it now, sometimes at 91 you get a slip of disc, as they say. But I remember the scripture, which is important, and that is from Colossians 3:17, that we should follow the example of Jesus Christ in everything that we do. Competency is that 4th C. Let me wrap up this section with just a couple of comments by 2 spiritual leaders. One, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who, when he was in communist Russia, was thrown in jail, a gulag, because he would not lie. And when he received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1970, he said, truth outweighs the whole world. And then from our leader, Jesus, in the Gospel of John, in the 8th chapter, he said, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. And in chapter 14, he said, I am the truth. We need to keep these 2 words before us because they are essentials. Truth and trust are essentials for anyone who is going to be a follower of Jesus Christ. Third, we are more divided. And this 3rd snapshot is of David and his son Absalom. And this is taken from 2 Samuel, chapter 15 and 18. And their relationship just didn't work. They were not getting along at all because Absalom wanted to take his father's place. He wanted to be king. And if you go to chapter 15, you read about the conspiracy that is going on there. What he does is he gets a chariot, he gets some horses, he has 50 men go before him. And then early in the morning, he goes by the side of the road outside of the gate of the city, and he meets with people, and he sweet-talks them. And he also listens to them. We all want to be listened to. And he says, what is the grievance you have that you are bringing to King David? Because if you came to me, if I was the judge, if I was the king, I would find in your favor. And so there's a verse there that says that he won the hearts of the people of Israel. And in the process, he divided the nation. I would like to talk about what we need to do to bring about unity and harmony when division occurs. And I believe that this story is a good place to start because I believe it has to start in the home. In the home. So the first thing I think we can do is that we can speak the truth in love. That can be a very hard and difficult thing to do, but it's also very important. We have a small group at our church back in Seattle, much as you have here. And when you get in these small groups, this is where you can tell the truth in love, right? Because the people know you, and you can be honest with them, and they can be honest with you. And one of the younger men in our group, he said, my parents kept asking to send over the kids. And my wife and I always found an excuse why we couldn't do it. And finally, they had a discussion and they said, the time has come for that difficult discussion. And so he went over to see his parents, and the parents said, "Where are the grandchildren?" And he said, "Well, that's why I'm here." And then he tried to speak the truth in love as best he could. And he said to his parents, "We don't feel comfortable sending our kids over to be with two alcoholics." Now, sometimes the message of telling the truth in love is hard to deliver, and it's also hard to receive. And I'm not going to tell you that it was solved immediately because of that one conversation, but over time, his parents got their life together. And second, they built a better relationship with their son and his wife. And third, they were able eventually to have a relationship and see the grandchildren. Telling the truth in love is one of the essentials for building harmony and getting rid of the division that exists between us. A second thing that we can do is that we can show loving kindness to one another. Now, I was fortunate. I had a great relationship with my father, and I have a great relationship with my son. And both of them have taught me so many lessons. But today I want to share a lesson that my father taught me through an experience that he had. He and my mother were doing a trip through the British Isles where he was preaching. And each weekend they would come to a particular community, and when he got to that community, he would call in advance and say, roughly what time they were going to be arriving and so forth. And on this occasion, a man happened to answer the phone, and my father explained that he was a guest of his, and the man told him in no uncertain terms, in a very brusque fashion, that he had not extended an invitation. He was a member of Parliament. He didn't want to have a Baptist minister at his house. No, it was his wife who had extended the invitation. And so he just wanted to make sure he understood that. And my father had some sympathy for him and understanding. And that night when they were at the home for dinner, the PM's elderly mother, widowed mother, 85 years of age, she got excused herself from the table to retire early, and my father got up from the table, went over, put his arms around her, hugged her, and gave her God's blessing for the night. And the next morning, that PM couldn't do enough for my folks. He said, "Parliament will have to work today without me. I'm taking you wherever you want to go. We'll have lunch. I'll show you the area." Just a little bit of kindness makes such a difference in ending division and bringing about harmony and unity. As Pastor Doug was driving me down here to Brewster, he was talking about you, and he was saying how kind, how generous the people of this church are. And I said, if we could only take that and spread it all over the country and all over the world, that's what we need to bring about unity and harmony. And finally, the fourth and final snapshot, if you will, and story is that we are less optimistic. We are less optimistic. And that snapshot comes from 1 Samuel chapter 17. In this story, we have the story of David, King Saul, and Goliath. And when the Philistine army when the Philistines came out and brought Goliath out there, and the Israelites saw Goliath, they were filled with fear and they fled. They were gone. And when King Saul saw the shepherd boy David, he was beside himself. He just said, "My gosh, you're only a boy, and Goliath has been a warrior since his youth." And that young shepherd boy, teenage shepherd boy, said in essence, "Have no fear, David is here." And out to the battlefield he went. And when Goliath saw him, he couldn't believe it. He said, "What am I, a dog that you come after me with a stick?" And David said, "I come to you in the name of the living God." And he took that slingshot, went right at him, and fired a stone right between his eyes, deep into his skull. And Goliath fell dead, and the Philistine army fled. And David had won a great victory because of his personal courage and his faith in the living God, and the people saluted him and celebrated him. I close today with the story of a modern-day David. Owen Burns. The story came out of Michigan this last May. They live in a little small rural community in Michigan in the Upper Peninsula near the Canadian border, and their house borders to a wooded area. And out of the woods came a person with evil intent, a sexual predator, who grabbed his 8-year-old little sister who was picking mushrooms in the backyard. And when Owen Burns, this 14-year-old teenager, saw him, he grabbed his slingshot, which he had been using since he was 7. And his dad said after the event, he always was a pretty good shot. And he went right at that intruder, and he just fired off 2 missiles that hit him with such force that he released Owen's little sister. And he ran into the woods, and when he was caught, they identified him by the wounds on his body. And the town celebrated Owen Burns for saving his sister. And they gave him money and gifts. And Owen said, I don't need the money. I don't need the gifts. I just did what was the right thing to do. Both David and Owen Burns didn't allow the Goliath complex to hinder them from doing what was right and doing what they knew had to be done, and neither should we. And we can do it also if we remember those words from Isaiah 40, that those who trust in the Lord will renew their strength. They will mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. We can do it. You can do it. We can meet life's challenges. And we can defeat loneliness. We can do it. We can put an end to the division between us. All of these things can be done. And no matter what issue it is that you have in your life today or tomorrow, you need only remember one thing. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Would you repeat that with me and say it with meaning? I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Amen.